They thought they could get away with it. Every single day, the Karen sisters strutted across my yard like they owned the place, smirking as they fiddled with my mailbox. At first I thought it was harmless, just nosy neighbors being nosy, but soon it became clear they were trespassing on purpose, digging through my mail, tossing letters onto the ground, even opening packages that weren't theirs. I complained to the HOA, but instead of helping, they laughed it off, telling me it was just neighborly curiosity. Neighborly curiosity? No, it was harassment. I was sick of it. My privacy was being invaded, my property disrespected, and the smug looks on their faces told me they believed I couldn't stop them. That was their biggest mistake. They underestimated me. I needed a plan, something bold, something unforgettable, something that would make them think twice before ever laying a finger on my mailbox again. I spent days plotting until I finally found the perfect answer: bees. Yes, bees. A buzzing, swarming, stinging reminder that my mailbox was off limits. I found a local beekeeper willing to lend me a hive, and with careful gloves and steady nerves, I transferred the buzzing army into my metal fortress. It was dangerous. It was crazy, but it was perfect. The next morning, as the sun climbed high and bright over the neighborhood, I waited from my porch with my coffee in hand. The Karen sisters came walking down the street, their smug faces already twisted in mischief, eyes locked on my mailbox. I leaned back in my chair, ready to watch the chaos unfold. They had no idea what was waiting for them inside. It all started with something so small, so stupid, I almost ignored it. One hot afternoon, the sun glaring down on our quiet suburban street, I walked outside to grab my mail. My mailbox sat at the edge of my driveway, a plain silver box with a red flag. I'd had it for years. Never once thought twice about it until I noticed my mail wasn't there. At first, I figured the postman was just late, but when I glanced around, I spotted two figures across the street, their blonde hair shining bright in the sun. The Karen sisters. Everyone in the neighborhood knew them. Lydia and Marla Karen, always walking in perfect step with one another, always dressed in matching outfits, always whispering about everyone else's business. They were nosy, proud, and entitled, like they thought the street belonged to them. If someone parked slightly too close to their driveway, they complained. If a child's bike left a tire track on the sidewalk, they shouted. They lived for drama, and now, apparently, they had chosen me. As I stood by my driveway that afternoon, I saw them with my letters in their hands. Lydia was holding a white envelope, squinting at the name on the front like it was her personal puzzle. Marla laughed at something, then tucked another envelope under her arm. My stomach turned. "Hey," I yelled, marching across the street. "That's my mail." They both froze. For a moment, their smiles faltered, but then just like that they were smirking again. Lydia dropped the envelope back into my box, as if she was doing me a favor. "Oh, don't be dramatic," Marla said, brushing her hair back. "We were just making sure nothing important got lost. You know how sloppy the mailman is." My blood boiled. "You can't touch my mail. That's illegal." They laughed, actually laughed. Lydia patted the top of my mailbox like it was hers. "Relax, we're neighbors. Neighbors look out for each other." I wanted to explode right there, but instead I snatched my envelopes and turned back toward my house. They followed me with their eyes the entire way, smiling like cats that had cornered a mouse. That night I told myself it was a one-time thing. They wouldn't be stupid enough to try it again. I was wrong. The very next day, around the same time, I looked out the window and saw them again. They weren't just peeking this time, they were digging. Marla had my mailbox wide open, rifling through envelopes, tossing aside one of my utility bills like it was junk. Lydia was bent over laughing, holding one of my small packages in her hands. She ripped the tape open with her nails and pulled out a phone charger I had ordered online. She looked at it with disgust and dropped it on the grass. I stormed outside so fast I nearly tripped on the porch steps. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted. The sisters froze again, but only for a second. Then they stood tall, smirking like before. "You ordered this? A cheap little charger?" Lydia scoffed. "Wow, we thought it might be something interesting." "You don't get to decide what's interesting," I snapped, picking the package off the ground. My hands were shaking with rage. "Stay away from my property. I'm serious." They rolled their eyes, turning to leave. "Whatever," Marla said with a little shrug. "It's not like you have anything worth taking anyway." That cut deeper than I wanted to admit. They weren't just nosy, they were mocking me, making a game out of it. And the worst part, I couldn't stop them. Not yet. Later that evening I drove straight to the HOA office. I laid out everything: the trespassing, the stolen mail, the opened package. I expected them to be shocked, to take action, but the head of the HOA, a heavy-set man with a lazy smile, just chuckled and waved me off. "Oh, the Karen sisters. They're harmless," he said. "They're just curious. That's all, curious." I nearly shouted, "They're stealing from me." The board members exchanged glances, all shrugging. One of them, a woman in a neat blouse, leaned forward. "Look, it's probably just neighbor drama. Best not to stir things up. If we get involved, it'll just make it worse." I left their office seething. That was it. They weren't going to help me. Nobody was. The third day was the worst yet. I had barely finished my morning coffee when I heard laughter outside. This time, the sisters weren't even pretending to be sneaky. They were standing right there at my mailbox in broad daylight, ripping open an envelope like it belonged to them. A check from my bank fell to the ground, and Marla picked it up, holding it to the sun like a prized jewel. "Wow," she said, waving it in the air. "Somebody's rich. Give that back," I shouted, running toward them. She tucked it behind her back, giggling until I was close enough to snatch it out of her hands. The two of them just laughed, like it was all a joke. Then Lydia leaned close and whispered, "You can't stop us. This street belongs to us." That was the moment something in me snapped. I knew yelling wouldn't work. I knew the HOA wouldn't help. These women thought they could walk all over me forever, and if I didn't do something, they were right. So I made a plan. A crazy, dangerous plan, but the only one that felt right. That night, as the neighborhood grew quiet, I sat at my desk researching. My fingers clicked furiously across the keyboard, pulling up articles about stinging insects, relocation services, and amateur beekeeping. I was terrified just reading about it, but also thrilled. The idea lodged itself in my brain like a seed, and by the time the clock struck midnight, I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I made a few calls. I found a beekeeper willing to lend me a hive for educational purposes. With a nervous laugh, I told him I wanted to study them for a day or two. He didn't ask many questions. When the day arrived, the sun rose bright and clear. Birds chirped, sprinklers hissed across front lawns, and the sisters hadn't yet made their rounds. I worked quickly, carefully, slipping on the heavy gloves the beekeeper provided. The hive buzzed angrily in its container, the sound both terrifying and strangely satisfying. My heart pounded as I opened my mailbox and gently slid the hive inside. When I stepped back, my hands shaking with adrenaline, I looked at the box and smiled for the first time in days. It wasn't just a mailbox anymore, it was a fortress, and the Karen sisters had no idea what was waiting for them. The morning after I placed the hive inside my mailbox, I woke up earlier than usual. My heart was racing even before I opened my eyes. It was one of those mornings when you don't need an alarm clock because your mind won't let you rest. The plan was in motion now, and there was no turning back. I walked into the kitchen, brewed a strong pot of coffee, and stood by the window overlooking my driveway. The sunlight stretched across the street, glinting off car roofs and sparkling in the dew on the grass. It was an ordinary suburban morning, peaceful on the surface. But I knew that peace wouldn't last. Not with the Karen sisters lurking around. I sat on the porch, steaming mug in hand, pretending to read the newspaper but really just waiting. My eyes kept drifting toward the mailbox. Even from here I could hear a faint hum, soft but steady, like a warning signal. It wasn't loud enough for anyone walking by to notice, but I knew what it meant. My secret weapon was alive and ready. Minutes ticked by. The street stayed quiet except for the occasional jogger or dog walker. I was beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the sisters had finally given up. But deep down I knew better. Their arrogance was bigger than their sense. Sure enough, around mid-morning they appeared. Lydia and Marla came strutting down the sidewalk in their usual matching outfits, bright floral blouses and wide-brimmed hats that made them look like they had just stepped out of a garden club meeting. They walked in perfect unison, their voices carrying across the street as they gossiped loudly about another neighbor's lawn being too brown for their taste. I gripped my coffee mug tighter, my pulse quickening. This was it. As they approached my yard, I forced myself to stay still, casual, like I wasn't waiting for this exact moment. I raised the newspaper higher, but my eyes peeked over the edge. They didn't even glance at me. Their attention was fixed on my mailbox. As if it were a treasure chest they had every right to open. Lydia reached it first, her fingers curling around the little metal door. She smirked at her sister. "Let's see what boring junk he's got today." Marla giggled, tugging at the brim of her hat. Probably another bill, or one of those pathetic little packages. The door creaked open. The buzzing exploded instantly. The bees surged out in a golden blur, sunlight catching their wings as they swarmed. Lydia let out a high-pitched scream, jerking backwards so fast she tripped over her own feet. Marla shrieked even louder, flailing her arms wildly as the swarm chased them into the street. Their matching hats flew off, tumbling across the pavement. I nearly choked on my coffee, trying not to laugh. It was chaos. Pure, buzzing chaos. The sisters ran in circles, slapping at the air, stumbling into each other as the bees followed relentlessly. Neighbors peeked out their doors, confused by the noise. One man watering his lawn dropped his hose, staring with wide eyes as the women shrieked their way down the block. Lydia darted behind a parked SUV, trying to shield herself, but the bees followed her, clinging to her blouse. Marla tried to hide under a tree, but when she brushed at the branches, more bees dropped down from the leaves. The sisters screamed and ran again, this time bolting straight toward their own house, shrieking loud enough to wake the whole street. I sipped my coffee, calm as ever, though my hands were trembling with excitement. My plan had worked. Worked perfectly. The commotion lasted several minutes, but finally the sisters disappeared inside their house, slamming the door shut behind them. The bees gradually returned to the hive, settling back into the mailbox until the buzzing quieted down again. The street fell silent, except for the laughter of a few neighbors who had witnessed the spectacle. I leaned back in my chair, grinning. But the victory, sweet as it was, didn't last long. That afternoon I noticed the sisters again. They had emerged from their house, their skin blotchy with red stings, their hair messy, their pride shattered. Yet somehow, even after what had happened, they weren't done. I watched as they marched toward the HOA office, arms flailing, pointing back at my yard. I knew what was coming. Sure enough, an hour later, the HOA president himself came strolling down the street with his clipboard, his round belly pushing against his polo shirt. The sisters followed closely behind him, their faces twisted in outrage. He stopped in front of my porch and cleared his throat. "We've had a complaint," he announced. I set my coffee down. "Oh really? About what?" "About bees." He adjusted his glasses. "Apparently you've turned your mailbox into some sort of hive." The sisters immediately jumped in. "He's endangering the whole neighborhood," Lydia shouted. "We could have died." "He set a trap," Marla added, her voice shrill. "That's criminal." I raised an eyebrow. "Criminal? Funny. Because last I checked, stealing mail is a federal crime, and unless I'm mistaken, you two have been helping yourselves to my letters all week." That shut them up for a moment. Their mouths opened and closed, but no words came out. The HOA president shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us. He wasn't a fan of confrontation. "Look," he said finally, "I don't want any drama here. Just maybe remove the bees, okay? For everyone's safety." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "I'll consider it, as long as my mailbox stays untouched from now on." The sisters gasped in unison, their faces red with fury. But they didn't argue. Not there, not with the president standing between us. They spun on their heels and stormed off, muttering insults under their breath as the HOA man walked away. I caught the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Maybe he didn't like the sisters as much as he pretended that night. I sat on my porch again, the faint hum of bees drifting from the mailbox. The neighborhood was unusually quiet, as if the swarm had left everyone just a little more cautious. For the first time in days, I felt real peace, but I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The Karen sisters weren't the kind to accept defeat gracefully. They'd be back, and when they came, they'd come harder. Still, as I finished the last sip of my coffee, I smiled to myself. Whatever they had planned, I was ready. Because this wasn't just about mail anymore. This was war. The day after the bee incident, the neighborhood was buzzing almost as much as my mailbox. Everywhere I went, whether it was out front watering my plants or walking to the corner store, people whispered, chuckled, and exchanged knowing glances. The story spread fast. The Karen sisters, screaming down the street in broad daylight, chased by a furious swarm of bees. Some neighbors thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. I overheard two teenagers laughing about it while skateboarding past my yard. An older man on the block gave me a subtle nod of approval, the kind of nod that says, "Good job," but I'll never admit it out loud. Not everyone approved, of course. A few folks muttered about safety hazards and what if a kid had opened the box instead. But even those comments were whispered carefully, like no one wanted to take the sisters' side too loudly. The sisters themselves, however, were not laughing, not even close. I spotted them later that morning standing together at the end of their driveway. They were covered in bug bite cream, their arms blotchy and red, their eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. They looked less like queens of the neighborhood and more like sulking children who had lost a game. Yet even from across the street, I could feel the heat of their glares. They weren't just angry. They were plotting. I tried not to dwell on it, but I couldn't help myself. I knew their type. Lydia and Marla weren't the kind of people who let things go. They didn't forgive, they didn't forget, and they sure as hell didn't accept humiliation. They lived on control, on power, and I had just stripped that from them in the most public way possible. The sting of the bees was nothing compared to the sting of embarrassment that afternoon. As the sun burned hot over the pavement, I sat on my porch with another mug of coffee, pretending to read while keeping an eye on the sisters. They were out front again, whispering furiously to each other, pointing at my yard. Their arms flailed as they spoke, their movements sharp and angry. Every now and then they glanced my way, and when our eyes met, they quickly turned back to whispering. By evening, I was certain of it. They were planning revenge. The first sign came the next morning. I stepped outside to grab the paper and nearly tripped over something on my porch. At first glance, I thought it was just trash, but then I realized it was a shoebox, one of those old cardboard ones. Inside were several crushed flowers and a note scribbled in messy handwriting. "Enjoy your bees while you can." There was no signature, no name, but I didn't need one. I crumpled the note in my hand, my jaw tightening. It was childish, sure, but it was also a warning. They wanted me to know they weren't done. Later that day, I noticed them loitering near the edge of my driveway again. This time, they weren't alone. They had dragged two other neighbors into their little sakula, nervous-looking woman named Carol and a man I barely knew from 3 houses down. The sisters were talking quickly, their voices sharp, their hands waving dramatically as if they were telling the most important story in the world. Carol kept nodding, though she looked uneasy. The man just frowned. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I knew they were rallying troops. spinning the story to make themselves look like victims. In their version, I was probably some unhinged maniac who had turned his mailbox into a weapon. They would leave out the part about stealing my mail, of course. I felt a knot in my stomach. As funny as the bee incident had been, I suddenly realized the game was changing. This wasn't about bees anymore. This was about reputation, about control, about who the neighborhood would believe. And the sisters were determined to paint me as the villain. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound outside made me sit up in bed, listening. Was that just the wind? Or were they sneaking across my lawn? Were they planning to tamper with the mailbox? Or worse, the hive? My mind spun with possibilities. By dawn, I was back on the porch, eyes heavy from lack of sleep, staring at the mailbox like it was a ticking bomb. The bees were quiet inside.com for now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. Around mid-morning, the sisters made their move. They came marching down the sidewalk, their faces set with grim determination. This time, they weren't empty-handed. Lydia carried a spray can, probably bug spray, and Marla had a thick broomstick in her grip. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up quickly, setting my coffee aside. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted. They froze, caught off guard by my sudden movement, but only for a second. Lydia lifted the spray can like it was a weapon. "We're protecting the neighborhood," she snapped. "You can't just keep bees in a mailbox. You're a danger to everyone." Marla jabbed the broomstick toward the box. "We're getting rid of them. Right now." I took a step closer, my fists clenched. "You touch that mailbox and you'll regret it." For a moment it was a standoff, the sisters on one side, me on the other. The sun glaring down on us as neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Then, slowly, a crowd began to gather. A few people stepped out onto their porches. Others lingered on the sidewalk, curious to see the showdown. The sisters raised their voices, playing to the audience. "He's endangering all of us," Lydia cried, shaking the spray can. "These bees could attack children, pets." "That's right," Marla added. "He's unstable. He set a trap for us." I laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "A trap? You mean the mailbox you've been stealing from? You mean the property you trespassed on, day after day? Funny how you leave that part out." The crowd murmured. Some of them looked at the sisters with doubt, others at me with suspicion. The air was heavy with tension. Finally, an older neighbor, Mrs. Dorsey, stepped forward. She was one of the longest residents on the block, respected by nearly everyone. Her voice was calm but firm. "I've seen you two messing with his mailbox more than once," she said, pointing at the sisters. "If you stayed out of his business, none of this would have happened." The sisters' faces went red. They sputtered, searching for words, but none came. For the first time, the crowd didn't seem to be on their side. They backed away slowly, still clutching their makeshift weapons but no longer brave enough to use them. "This isn't over," Lydia hissed, glaring at me. "We'll make sure of it." I watched them retreat, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The crowd eventually dispersed, whispering as they went. But the message was clear. The war had just escalated. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I sat back on my porch staring at the mailbox. The bees were quiet again, but I knew peace wouldn't last. The sisters weren't done. They had been humiliated twice now, and humiliation was something they could never forgive. They would be back, and next time they wouldn't just come with bug spray and a broom. The next few days felt uneasy, like the calm before a storm. On the surface, everything looked normal. The sun shone bright across the neighborhood lawns. Sprinklers clicked in rhythmic patterns, and children rode their bikes up and down the street. But I couldn't relax. I knew the sisters too well by now. They weren't the type to lick their wounds and give up. They were schemers, and every time I caught a glimpse of them whispering in their driveway, my stomach tightened. I doubled down on my routine of watching. Every morning, I sat on my porch with coffee in hand, pretending to read the paper, while really keeping one eye on my mailbox. The bees were calm most days, the hive humming quietly inside. I took comfort in that sound. It was like having tiny loyal guards ready at any moment. Still, I couldn't help but imagine what the sisters were planning. Bug spray and broomsticks hadn't worked, so what would they try next? On the fourth morning after the confrontation, I got my answer. It started with a truck pulling up in front of the Karen sisters' house. It wasn't the mail truck or a delivery van, it was an exterminator. The words "pest removal experts" were plastered in big bold letters across the side. My stomach dropped. I watched as Lydia and Marla bustled out of their house, pointing dramatically toward my yard, their voices shrill even from a distance. The exterminator, a tall man in overalls, scratched his head as he listened. He nodded a few times, then grabbed his equipment. That's when I stood up. "Hey," I called across the street, my voice booming. "Don't touch my property." The exterminator froze, startled, then looked between me and the sisters. Lydia immediately shouted back, "We hide him. These bees are a threat to the whole block. They're not a threat to anyone who stays out of my mailbox." I shot back. A few neighbors poked their heads out of their doors, curious again. It was turning into another show, and I wasn't about to let the sisters spin it in their favor. I walked down my driveway, stopping right at the edge of my lawn. "Sir," I said firmly to the exterminator, "that's private property. You set one foot in my yard, and I'll call the police." Trespassing and destruction of property. Your choice. The exterminator shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at the sisters, then at me. Look, I don't want trouble, he muttered. I just do what I'm paid for. You won't be paid if you end up in court, I warned. The man hesitated for a long moment, then finally sighed. You folks need to work this out yourselves. I'm not getting in the middle of it. He packed his gear back into the truck and drove off. The sisters stood there fuming, their faces red with rage. Marla pointed at me with a trembling finger. You think you're clever, don't you? You won't win. We'll make sure of it. Lydia grabbed her arm and pulled her back toward their house, but her glare lingered on me until the very last second. The crowd of neighbors watching began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others whispering to each other. I caught a few smirks, people who clearly thought the sisters were getting what they deserved. That gave me a little satisfaction, but not much. The truth was, I felt like I was living under siege that evening. I sat on my porch longer than usual, the sky glowing orange as the sun dipped low. The bees were still humming softly in the mailbox, but I found myself restless. If the sisters were willing to bring in an exterminator, what would they do next? Poison fire? Something worse? I decided I couldn't just wait for them to strike again. I needed to take control of the game, just like I had with the bees. The next morning, I put my plan into motion. At sunrise, while most of the neighborhood was still asleep, I pulled on my gloves and carefully checked the hive inside the mailbox. The bees were thriving, buzzing in steady waves of activity. I didn't move them this time. Instead, I added something new, a small warning sign I'd made the night before. I staked it right next to the mailbox. Painted in bold red letters, warning. Active hive, do not touch it, was simple, legal, and impossible to ignore. Now if the sisters tried anything, they couldn't claim they didn't know. By mid-morning, the sisters were out again. The moment they saw the sign, they stopped dead in their tracks. Marla let out a dramatic gasp, clutching her chest. Lydia stormed forward a few steps, fists clenched. This is harassment, she screamed across the street. You're terrorizing the neighborhood. I leaned casually against the porch railing. It's called a warning sign. Perfectly legal. You stay away. You stay safe. Problem solved. They sputtered, their anger boiling over, but with neighbors watching again, they didn't dare make another move. Instead, they stomped back into their house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. For the rest of the day, things were quiet, too quiet that night. As I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sisters weren't done. If anything, the sign had only embarrassed them further. They thrived on power, and every failure just made them more desperate. Sure enough, the following morning, I caught movement outside at an odd hour just before dawn, when the sky was still painted with the faintest streaks of gray and pink, peeking through my curtains. I saw two figures sneaking toward my yard. It was them. They were dressed in dark jackets, moving quickly, quietly. Marla carried something in her hand, what looked like a bucket. Lydia had a flashlight, its beam darting nervously across the ground. I slipped on my shoes and crept to the front door, heart pounding. I didn't step outside yet. I wanted to see what they were up to. They reached the mailbox, whispering furiously to each other. Marla tilted the bucket, and the sharp smell of chemicals hit the air even from where I stood. They were trying to poison the hive. That was it. I flung open the door and stormed onto the porch. Caught you red-handed, I roared. The sisters jumped, spilling half the bucket onto the ground. The liquid hissed against the pavement, a sharp chemical stench rising. Lydia shrieked and dropped the flashlight, which rolled across the driveway. Neighbors' lights flicked on instantly. Curtains rustled. Doors opened. The street began waking up to the sight of the Karen sisters crouched at my mailbox with a bucket of poison in hand. I pointed at them, my voice steady and loud. These two have been trespassing, stealing, and now they're trying to destroy my property. Enough is enough. I'm calling the police. The sisters stammered, their voices high and panicked. Oh no, you don't understand, these bees are dangerous. We were protecting everyone. But this time, nobody believed them. A few neighbors called out from their porches, telling them to leave me alone. One man shouted, "We've had enough of you two." Their faces crumbled. They dropped the bucket and flashlight, then bolted back toward their house. Humiliated once again, I stood tall on my porch, the morning sun finally breaking over the rooftops. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, I felt like the tide was turning in my favor, because now, the whole neighborhood had seen the truth. The poison attempt changed everything. Up until then, the war with the Karen sisters had been about annoyance, humiliation, and control. They wanted power over me, and I had fought back with creativity and stubbornness. But when they snuck into my yard in the early morning hours with a bucket of chemicals, they crossed a line they couldn't uncross. They weren't just trespassers anymore. They were dangerous. The next morning, I walked to the mailbox, gloves on, carefully checking the hive. The bees were fine, resilient as ever. A few still buzzed angrily near the spot where the poison had spilled on the pavement, but the hive had survived. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by determination. I knew the sisters wouldn't stop until something forced them to. Later that day, I made my move. I contacted the police, something I hadn't done before because I wanted to avoid making things bigger than they had to be. But with the attempted poisoning, I finally had solid evidence. I showed the officers the security camera footage I'd set up after the broomstick incident. The footage was crystal clear. 2 women creeping across my driveway, one with a bucket, the other with a flashlight. Their faces were obvious, their actions undeniable. The officers took notes, exchanged glances, and nodded. "We'll take it from here," one of them assured me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a real weight lift off my shoulders. The fallout was fast. 2 days later, the sisters' house was visited by police cars. The flashing lights drew half the neighborhood out to watch. Lydia and Marla stood in their driveway, arms flailing, voices raised, trying to explain themselves. But no amount of dramatic excuses could undo the footage. They weren't arrested, but they were issued a formal warning for trespassing, harassment, and attempted property damage. The officers made it very clear. One more incident, and they'd face criminal charges. The sisters' faces burned red with humiliation as neighbors gathered on sidewalks, whispering and pointing. For women who thrived on control and respect, it was the ultimate defeat. And for me, it was the sweetest victory yet. In the days that followed, the street felt different, calmer. The sisters no longer strutted around like royalty. They barely left their house at all. When they did, they kept their heads low, their movements fast, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The gossip, once their weapon, had turned against them. People muttered about their downfall, about how they had finally been put in their place. My mailbox stood untouched. The bees continued to thrive, their steady hum a background soundtrack to my mornings. But I no longer needed them as guards. The sisters had lost their fight. The neighborhood knew it, and so did they. One bright Saturday morning, as I sipped coffee on my porch, I noticed a for sale sign going up in front of their house. 2 men hammered it into the lawn while the sisters stood on the porch, arms crossed, their faces bitter and pale. I couldn't help the smile that spread across my face. They weren't just beaten, they were leaving. The Karens who had tormented everyone for years were packing up and moving out. It took weeks for the sale to go through, but eventually a moving truck appeared, and the sisters' belongings were carried out one by one. The whole neighborhood seemed to breathe easier that day. Some people even came out to watch the truck drive away, like spectators at a parade. Except this parade was a celebration of peace. That's for me. I stood at the edge of my driveway, leaning against my mailbox, the very place this war had begun. The sisters climbed into their car, glaring at me one last time as they drove off. Their eyes still held anger, but behind it was something new, defeat. When their car disappeared down the street, I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast. The war was over. The bees stayed in the mailbox a little longer, but eventually I arranged with the beekeeper to relocate them safely. They had done their job, and I didn't need them anymore. What had started as a crazy idea had turned into the perfect defense, and in the end, it had given me more than just victory, it had given me peace. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. People stopped whispering. Children played without fear of being yelled at, and for the first time in years, everyone felt like the street truly belonged to them, not to the sisters. My mornings became quiet again. Just me, my coffee, and the hum of life all around. Sometimes, I still catch myself glancing toward the house across the street, half expecting to see Lydia and Marla standing there with their smug smiles. But the house is quiet now, occupied by a new family that minds their own business. It's strange. For weeks, the war consumed me. Every day felt like a battle, every encounter a test of will. But now that it's over, I realize something important. Sometimes the only way to deal with bullies is to stand your ground, to fight back in a way they don't expect. And sometimes, that fight comes with wings and stingers. That as I sat on my porch that final evening, the sun setting warm and golden over the rooftops, I couldn't help but laugh. Who would have thought a simple mailbox could start a war and end one? The Karen sisters were gone, the neighborhood was free, and I had my peace back. And all it took was bees.